Hello folks, welcome to the channel. My name's Heath Home, Ableton trainer and Point Blank Ibiza music instructor. I wanted to make a video today to show Ableton Live users how that using Ableton native devices we can create our own fairly realistic sounding TB-303 synthesizer. I will make a disclaimer though, and that is that you can't beat the original. The original Roland TB-303 synthesizer is the most authentic sounding of the lot. If you're lucky enough to own one of those, I guess you don't need to be watching this tutorial. There are, of course, as well, re-releases from Roland, such as the Boutique, their TB-3, Behringer have done a clone, and there are also a range of fantastic plugins that make 303-like sounds. But I thought, well, not all of us are lucky enough to own those or can afford those options, and if you're an Ableton Live user and you have the suite version of the program, then I think you can create your own pretty effective synthesizer within the software itself and make your own acid loops and sounds for your projects. So without further ado, let's get started, and I will point out that, as I said, this tutorial will suit the suite or studio version owners of Ableton Live, as I am going to use a Max for Live device. If you're not an owner of that particular software, but you can incorporate Max for Live devices, you can head over to maxforlive.com, and there are some great free sequences on that particular community site that you can download for free and potentially follow along with this workflow idea. So yeah, let's get started. We're going to need a couple of MIDI tracks, which I have already programmed into the window here, alongside one pre-programmed track, which is an audio drum track, just to give us a groove of something to play along to with our sequence later on. The other thing I'll point out is that there are plenty of tutorials online about making 303-like sounds even with Ableton devices, but a lot of them don't share the MIDI creation at the start of the process. They start with a sequence already programmed in and just get on to shaping the sound. I want to do both, so I want to cover how to make some great MIDI to play the synthesizer. So that's really the sort of emphasis of this tutorial. We're going right from the beginning, from the 0 point. So it might take a little longer than 5 minutes, but we'll get there and we'll cover it nice and comprehensively. So on my first MIDI track here, titled MIDI 2, I'm just going to click on its title at the top, Command R on my keyboard, and I'm going to name this one the MIDI Bus. And then I'm going to click on MIDI track number 1, Command R, and we can already call this TB-303 just to make things a little easier. I'm then going to come over to the MIDI Bus track, and in the first empty clip slot, I'm going to double click to create a MIDI clip. Come into the MIDI clip and punch in a note at C3, middle C on the piano, come over to the notes section of the clip, click legato, and I now have a 1 bar length sustained middle C note. That's all I need to do there. I'm then going to come down to the MIDI bus track to where the in and out panel section is, and I'm going to go to the MIDI 2 section of it, click the box where it says no output, and I'm going to choose TB-303. So now anything that happens in this MIDI bus track is now going to head over into the TB-303 track, and we now need to set up the TB-303 track. So if I click on that, come into the ins and outs section, go to MIDI from, drop down the box there and choose MIDI bus, and then where the monitor section is, choose in. We now have the TB-303 track set up to receive MIDI in from the MIDI bus. You'll see why I do this a little bit later on, but it's my preferred workflow, and I think it makes sense to make things a lot smoother and easier to work with. I'm now going to click on the circle up here to open up my Ableton browser, and from the categories section, I'm going to click on instruments, and I'm going to choose an analog synthesizer, drag that over and drop it on the TB-303 track. And I'm going to now go to Max for Live in the categories section, head up to the search engine of the browser and type in mono, SEQ for mono sequencer, and it sends me over to this MIDI effects section. Drop down the arrow there, and there is the mono sequencer. I'm going to grab that, drag it over and drop it on the MIDI bus, and boom, we get a sound straight away, which is a good start. So First things first, I'm going to work a little bit on the MIDI Bus track, which now contains this mono sequencer, and I'm going to break down what elements make up what make a TB-303 a 303. And one of those first things is that the TB-303 had a sequencer in it where we could program in the notes we want the synthesizer to play. We could program in the accent, which is another way for saying velocity, so how hard or soft the notes play. We could give the synth some octave information, play high octaves or low octaves, and also how long or short the notes would be. So by using this Max for Live device, we can recreate exactly that same sequencer concept. So if we look at this Max for Live sequencer, if we look down the bottom, you'll see there's a section with a lot of these squares, blue boxes, and there's a number and a sort of column at the top of 1 to 16. The significance of that is we can have a minimum of 1 step and a maximum of 16 inside this sequencer, and you can vary the lengths of your sequence to create some rather interesting patterns. So you don't have to stick with 16 or an even number. It can actually be quite cool to use odd numbers like 11, 9, 7 to create polyrhythms. So I'm actually going to choose my the global step sequencer part down the bottom here to show 9. And so we now have 9 steps in our sequence. So if I push play, just push my clip up here, it's now cycling through 9 steps. And if we click on any of these squares, we can remove steps, which you can hear creates a rhythmic pattern. Very cool. So I'm going to leave a couple of steps out. And then if we start to work our way along the other categories, we have pitch, velocity, octave, duration, and all of those categories have their own step sequencer length. So again, we can start to have variations. We could have 11 steps on one and 7 on another. So tons of fun to be had creating variations via different step lengths for each parameter. So I'm going to come to duration. We already have some duration plugged in here, which is allowing the sound to happen. If there was no duration, no sound. So I'm just going to drag the duration over to 9 steps, and I'm going to put in some random note duration lengths. So that's short and long notes. Pretty cool to start with. They're going to head up to the octave parameter, drag it into 9 steps as well, and just randomly with the mouse I'm dialing in some different octaves. And as I said, for the moment, it's going to be pretty random. We can come back and fine tune those at a later point. Then with the velocity, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm actually going to choose 11 steps for the velocity, just so we already have now a nice different variation of steps. So the velocity will cycle outside of the same cycle of the pitch and the global steps. Cool. And then finally up to pitch and dial in some random pitch. And again, I'm going to choose 9 steps there. Now that sounds pretty wonky, and there's a good reason for that, because at the moment those pitch values are not set to conform to any particular music idea or scale. And if we had chord progressions and melodies and other ideas in our project, this could cause a problem if we wouldn't have any tuning between our sequencer and those other musical elements. So a great way to control that is to come over to our browser, open up that section, and we're going to head to the categories, MIDI effects. And if you're not familiar with Ableton's scale MIDI effect, hopefully this tutorial might show you a little bit of insight. I'm going to click the arrow alongside the scale MIDI effect to open it up. And I'm going to head down here. There are lots of different scales we can choose. I'm going to choose the C minor scale device, already programmed as a C minor. Drag it over behind the mono sequencer. And that now means that anything that happens inside the sequencer is going to be pushed into the C minor scale. Any notes that play a note outside of that scale will be bounced down or bounced up to fit exactly within the scale. And you'll notice the scale device has this bass knob or parameter over here. And if we move that up and down, if our track is in A minor, well, we can just move the bass parameter to A, and now our sequence is pushing and working through the scale of A minor. Or we could choose G minor over here, or we could choose D minor down here. So very, very cool. We can also transpose the value by semitones or octaves. So 12 semitones is an octave lower. I'm going to leave that at 0. So yeah, really critical MIDI effect, and something that's great to use in this case, because it means whatever our idea we have in our sequencer is conforming to a musical idea and the rest of our project potentially. The other MIDI effect I'm going to use on this MIDI Bus channel is one called the Random, and I'm going to grab that, drag that down, and I'm going to drop one of those in front of the mono sequencer. Now the Random is going to allow me to also modify these pitch values that I have in the sequencer and randomize them effectively. And because we've got that scale device at the end of the chain, there's going to be no issues. Everything's going to be staying conforming to the scale we've chosen. So if I choose, for example, 100% on the chance parameter, there's a 100% chance that each time one of these pitches play, it will be modified by the random device. Now, how it's modified is down the bottom here in this section where it says sign. If it says add, it will randomly add a pitch, add a note to the pitch that's playing. If it's chosen, if sub is chosen in the sign section, it will subtract the pitch. And if bidirectional was chosen, then it will sometimes play the pitch up, or sometimes it will play the pitch down. And then finally alongside this we have scale. So right now it's 1 octave that it can potentially pitch the notes up or down or both. So you can also change the scale to be more than 1 octave. So I'm going to keep the scale on 1, and I'm going to keep it at add for the moment. And if you watch this section up here, I'll leave it at 100% chance. Every time there's a blue circle in the plus section, it's adding a note, adding a pitch variation. So if I now change it to sub, it will subtract. So down in the minus section here. Cool. And if I choose bi, you'll see it will move between sometimes being a minus and sometimes a plus. And then we can dial this back a bit to say 50%, so it's not as frequent. I'm going to keep it at add, or even say 30%. So lots of flexibility there, and that gives us even more variation. And because we've got this scale device here, everything's staying nicely unified in a musical idea. So moving on, I'm going to head over to my TB-303 track now and start to get the synthesizer to sound like how a TB-303 sounds. So first of all, a TB-303 had only 1 oscillator. So on the analog panel here, we're going to turn off oscillator 2 and just have ourselves oscillator 1. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to come over to the global volume shell on the right hand side of the analog, click it to open up this middle panel, and we're going to turn where it says voices and the number 8, we're going to click on the arrow and choose mono. So the Roland TB-303 was a mono synthesizer, and it had 1 oscillator only. So that's a good starting point. Let's have a listen. Okay, it's still sounding pretty basic. On the oscillator panel, the Roland TB-303 had a choice between 2 wave shapes, the sawtooth, which it is currently, and also the square wave. So we can have a listen to the square wave or the sawtooth. So the sawtooth being a bit more sort of raspy and bitey. The next thing, if we move our way along a little bit through the synth, if we come to the amplitude envelope and panel here, I'm just going to bring the release a little bit shorter on the envelope, and I can do that by just dragging this release number up here down a little bit, just to shorten the note up a bit. And then on the filter frequency section here, we've got a frequency cutoff knob and a resonance knob, and the type of the filter is a low pass 24, which I believe is the correct type for the Roland TB-303, so we're in a good shape there. So what we might do here is just tweak the envelope a little bit first, and then we'll also adjust these parameters. So with the envelope, I'm going to bring the sustain down, turn my synth up a bit, all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to bring the decay a little bit shorter, like so. Then I'm going to bring the filter frequency down, nice, and the resonance up. So it's starting to sound a little bit acid-esque. The next thing we're going to do is come back over to our global shell here on the analog, click on it, and another element of unique and specific to the Roland TB-303 was the glide, or the fact that notes were able to bend from one end to the other. And so on the analog synth here, we can turn on this box called glide at the bottom and dial in a percentage value to achieve that same sort of pitch bending effect that the 303 was famous for. So let's have a listen. I might drop down an octave on the oscillator panel here, so just clicking an octave down. And you can hear moving the decay of the filter envelope changes the sound nicely. Pushing the glide changes the sound. Opening and closing the filter. So we've kind of got an acid-esque sound happening. The next step I'm going to do is add some effects. So let's just push the volume up a bit so you can hear it. I'm going to add in the drums. And what I'm going to do is open up the Ableton browser, head to audio effects, and I'm going to grab myself the overdrive for a bit of distortion, and I'm going to grab myself a delay to delay the bass slightly. So let's turn off the delay and start with the overdrive. So if we're looking for a dirty sort of 303 sound, bring the filter down a little bit. The dry wet. So we've got ourselves a dirty 303. Now we can bring in the delay, turn that on. Bring the feedback down. Bring in a little bit of feedback. Dry wet down. Maybe some ping pong delay. Bring the delay filter down as well. Adjust that to taste. Cool. So now we could come back into the MIDI bus and play around again with some of these parameters we adjusted earlier. Maybe more chance. Maybe subtract. Or buy. Let's come in here. I'm actually just playing around with the filter envelope back on the synth, and you can also modify the attack a little bit of the filter envelope for more cool acidish vibes. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the sound. Now what I would do is on the TB-303 track here, I would click on the analog synth, hold down shift on my keyboard, click on the overdrive and the delay so they're all selected together, Command G to group those into an instrument rack. I would click on the first circle below the on-off button to open up the macro section, and I now start mapping some of the favorite parameters that I want to be able to adjust over time to modify my sound onto this instrument rack. So I would take from the analog synth the filter frequency. So if I right click on that parameter with the mouse, map to macro 1, click on the macro 1 to name it. So I'm just going to rename it to what I want to call it, filter frequency. I'm then going to click on the filter frequency, filter section resonance, right click the mouse, map that to macro 2. Again, clicking on the macro itself, I'm going to rename that filter res. I'm then going to, what else would I like to have control of? I'm going to take the decay of the filter envelope. So I'm going to right click on that value, map that to macro 3. Again, Command R to name it. So filter decay. So I know exactly what that is. And then I might come over to the effects, and with the overdrive, I'm going to click on the dry wet, right click that and map that to macro 4. Command R on the macro itself, and I'm going to name that distort because that's what that's basically doing. And then on the delay, I'm going to take the dry wet, right click it with the mouse, map that to macro 5. Command R on the macro itself and call that the delay dry wet. Nice. And now what I would do is double click the devices to collapse them, and this lower circle down here can also click that to collapse the device into just the instrument rack. Click on the title here, Command R to name it, call it the TB-303, and on each of the macros, if I right click them with the mouse, I can give them a color. So I'm going to give the filter the nice color of red, the distortion I'm going to give orange, and the delay I'll give a nice yellow. And so now I have that collapsed into a nice little device. So if we're playing away here with a MIDI controller, we can map all these macros to a MIDI controller, or if you have a push, they're automatically mapped. And we can now have a lot of fun. The next thing I would do is click on my browser to open it up, head to the user library section in places. I'd right click in there and create a new folder, or perhaps I already had an existing folder, and I would drag that lovely instrument up and into there, and now we have that saved for future use whenever we wish to use it, or we can distribute it to friends, etc. And then what I would do is come to the MIDI Bus track, and a similar thing, I can click, hold down shift on my keyboard, click on the titles of all the devices, Command G, group them into a device, MIDI effect device rack, and click on the macro tab to open that up. And maybe I'll take the chance of the random and map that to macro 1. So right clicking on it and mapping it over there onto macro 1. And what else? I won't go into too much here. Maybe the base of the scale to macro 2. Again, collapse all the devices and we can shut them off. We can give these a nice little color if we wish. And there we have our MIDI effect. We can Command R to name it, call it the mono sequence. We could repurpose this for other things. It doesn't have to be called the 303. It's just creating a sequence at this point in time, and the random and the scale are very handy to have as part of the device. And then we could also save that up into the same folder or another one, and we have created 2 excellent new devices we have saved in our user library for future use. Now, the last final thing that's really cool about the workflow method here is that right now, MIDI-wise, the sequence is creating our MIDI pattern to play the synthesizer, but maybe we want to print some of that MIDI so that we can visually see it and even save that MIDI sequence or change the instrument, etc. So I'll show you how to do that. Now all I need to do is actually click on one of these record slots under the TB-303 and it should start straight away recording MIDI notes. So let's do that. And I'm just gonna make sure the chance was active over here. You can see now I've got all this lovely MIDI printing into this MIDI clip with all of its lovely variations, and this can go on recording for as long as we wish, and we can tweak things around on the MIDI bus if we wish. And when we're done, we can come over here and just do a few things. We can turn off the MIDI bus track, we don't need that anymore, and we can turn the TB-303 MIDI track to auto, so it's now just a normal track. Change the MIDI from the MIDI bus to no input, and we now have the MIDI here playing the synthesizer, and we can move around within the clip, moving the loop brace around, and maybe we find a favorite part of the sequence, so something like, perhaps we like this one, those two bars, or so I really like that section. So what I would probably do is duplicate this MIDI clip. So I've got an original one, Command R to name it. And then on this one that I've now decided of that loop, I would click on the highlighted section with the mouse, crop, and now I've got this lovely MIDI clip here with my MIDI notes playing that sequence, which again I can bounce out or use on other instruments, etc. But I've now also got the MIDI sequence that I created using the MIDI bus, etc. So I hope that's been really insightful and super useful. A great way, in my opinion, to make your own Ableton 303 device to make those lovely acid loops for your tracks. That's going to be a wrap for today. If you've got any suggestions about future tutorials, please pop them in the comments below. And of course, give me some feedback. Let me know what you thought of the video. And if you're new to this channel, please hit the subscribe button and smash the bell so you can keep up to date when I do another tutorial on all things Ableton Live. So that's going to be it from me. Peace out, everybody, and go make some tunes. Ciao.